The first up on the discovery process, types of the types of discovery that you can do, the types of actions, the way you do conduct discovery is the deposition. Deposition is probably the most popular, the one you hear about the most. It's the one that probably is most exciting when it comes to any of the discovery methods. It's not the first one you'll do generally, but it's the one that probably carries the most influence. Okay, influence. The deposition is basically a out-of-court question-and-answer session under oath prior to a trial. In other words, you are bringing people to be questioned under oath so that they are bound to tell the truth and subject to the penalties of perjury. Okay. And what happens there, we'll see who is there. But what is the purpose? Basically, let's say I'm the plaintiff as counsel. So I have Jane Doe as my client, and she's the plaintiff. And I'm suing Bob Smith because of a car accident, and I want to know what it is Bob Smith knows about the accident. So I want to depose Bob Smith. Okay, so what I do is then I'll ask for I'll send out a notice of intent to take oral deposition. I send that to Bob's lawyer, and Bob's lawyer will probably negotiate a time to have this thing. And Bob will then come in front of me, and I'll show up. Him and his lawyer will show up, and a court reporter will show up. And what will happen then is I will ask Bob a bunch of questions. I'm trying to get his testimony. In other words, what he's going to say at trial. Okay. In most depositions, the counsel for the deponent, in this case it would be Bob's counsel, would not ask any questions or very few questions unless they were for clarity purposes. Bob's lawyer can ask Bob outright what the evidence is. He or she doesn't need to ask Bob under oath, because he or she can talk to Bob and get those answers. Me, as lawyer for Jane, can't do that. I have to ask him under oath, because otherwise Bob could lie to me, for one thing. He doesn't have any relationship with me, so it doesn't really matter to Bob to tell me the evidence. In other words, Bob's lawyer has the ability to investigate and use an investigator through Bob to get Bob's testimony. Basically what he's going to say. He has a vested interest, Bob does, in telling his lawyer who, what, when, where, and how. And he has no vested interest in telling me, as the plaintiff's counsel, those things. So the vested part is his obligation to tell the truth. So that's why I bring in to a deposition. This is discovery at its finest. This is where I get to ask Bob questions so I can get the specific answers that he knows. I don't have to formulate a written question. I can ask him, and then I can ask follow-ups. It's kind of like being a reporter in some ways. The purpose is really the drawn-out pieces of his testimony, what he actually recalls, how good is his memory. One of the things I'm going to do at a deposition is see where his memory is weak. And then I'm going to end up with a transcript of his testimony so I can refer back to that when we come to trial and see if he changed his story, all those kinds of things. So what can be asked about? That's the same stuff that's discoverable. Any non-privileged matter that's relevant to the case. It doesn't have to be admissible. Remember those things. There are three basic types. There's the traditional deposition, the e-deposition, and the deposition upon written questions. Kind of three interesting things that happen there. The traditional one is where we would sit down in a room, and that would be the lawyer for all parties, the deponent, that's the person being asked the questions, a court reporter who will take it down verbatim, and any of the parties may attend the deposition. That's who's there. We ask questions, we go right, anybody who was against or, on the opposite side, or even a co-defendant or co-plaintiff with Bob, in my example, could ask Bob questions. Again, Bob's lawyer probably will not ask questions, probably would only object to some certain things. But even then, can't object to admissibility later, only about its privileged nature or its relevancy is the main two things that you could really object to. Obviously, later you could file a motion in limine on the evidence question to determine whether it was admissible or not, and we'll use the testimony that's developed during a deposition to help the court answer that question. That's a traditional one. It's the one that allows follow-up questions. It allows all those things that are kind of nice. That's the traditional route. An e-deposition is basically when we do it kind of like we're doing these videos, where you could potentially have live streamed with me while we were watching, or while I was conducting the video and talking, and where we're doing it by FaceTime, or we're doing it by Skype, or we're doing it through some kind of video conferencing. I'm sitting in one place and you're sitting in another, and I'm asking you questions. I'm going to ask you to consider what are the advantages and disadvantages of both an oral deposition and a e-deposition. E-depositions, a lot of times the video camera is just like looking at the person's face. You can't really tell who's around the room because it's just a video of the person. So if I was asking the questions, I might be sitting on one end. In my example, Bob would be facing the camera. I would be facing the camera. We would just be looking at each other. But there's also, remember, going to be a court reporter. Bob's lawyer is going to be there on his side. Somewhere the court reporter is going to be. It may just be a videotape deposition. So there'll be a court reporter running the video, that kind of thing. But when I'm asking questions, I can't really see who Bob's looking at for answers, okay, or how his reactions to questions. So some of those things, that's one of the questions I have for you. What are the advantages of the traditional oral deposition? What are the advantages, disadvantages of e-depositions? Deposition upon written questions. We'll get to that here in a second as we get to the bottom. How do I go about taking an oral deposition? I basically set forth a notice of intent to take deposition. I set it forth and I say when and where it's going to be. Okay, pretty simple stuff in that regard. Basically, I set forth like when and where, and usually the best thing to do is to cooperate and to ask each other when would be a good time, and you want to set up your schedules and all that good stuff. There's not a lot to it. You basically, the biggest factor you really have to put in there is what is the subject matter of this, so everybody knows what you're going to ask questions about, what you're trying to find out. Sometimes what's included also is a request for documents that you bring certain things with you. That's important also. So a couple other questions. Can you depose a non-party witness? The answer is very simply yes. Can you depose them the same way you can a party witness? You can ask them the same kind of questions, but getting them there is the problem. So how do you do that? Okay. Also, do non-party witnesses have to produce documents? That's interesting too. Using the same kind of thinking is, can you do it for a non-party witness? Yes. Can I depose them? All I have to do is tell them where they have to be, basically. I give them a notice. They have to come because they're a party to the case. If they don't want to come, we can say you lose one way or another. But what about non-party witnesses? How do we get them there? There's a tool that we could use in the court system to get a non-party witness to a deposition. Do they have to produce documents? Well, if I'm going to ask you about those documents, you should have to bring them, right? But I've got to ask you a special way. I can't just tell you to bring them. I have to ask you a special way. Maybe the court has to order you, or at least the court's powers have to bring you. So how do you do those two things? Interesting. How do you defend a deposition? Well, I think the best way to defend a deposition is to prepare the client or prepare the deponent, and using the 5 C's. Confident, clear and convincing, correct, candid. Here's my key. Whenever you have somebody that wants to testify, you tell them a couple of very simple pieces of advice. First thing is just tell the truth, okay? The second thing that I believe is make sure you listen and wait for the question to be asked before you answer it, okay? The third thing I say is answer only the question that was asked. Do not try to extrapolate and embellish or say extra things. Answer the question. They ask you a yes or no, answer yes or no. If they want more information, they will ask for more information. So don't volunteer evident things. That doesn't mean that you're hiding anything. It's just you're going to get nervous. The client needs to be brought down so that it's very as calming as possible so that you don't say things that aren't really important. And the other thing is you can be misunderstood, and that can be a problem too. And when you go back and they're going to testify later. Okay, you can also defend a deposition by bringing forth objections. A lot of times, the main thing is, in a deposition, a lawyer will just say, "Objection, you may answer." The reason is they're objecting to that evidence being admissible later in court, and it's just a place to kind of mark the record that you want to bring that back up later, possibly with court in a motion in limine, or you might object to that testimony at trial, but you might need to do a little research to support your objection, that kind of thing. You can also ask or object that the question's overbroad. Overbroad means you're trying to ask too much in one question, or that you've asked and answered those questions. That's the duplicative objection. What do you do if you're a paralegal or you're not questioning? You're going to take notes, you're going to evaluate the witnesses, you'll arrange for the transcripts afterwards, and you'll probably summarize the deposition. Lastly, something I think is kind of an interesting point, the deposition upon written questions. This is a weird method, but basically I write you some questions and I ask you to answer them on video under oath. So I'm going to write out the questions and I'm going to give them to you under oath. So why would I do that? Why would I have you give you questions beforehand that you're going to answer under oath, but on video or recorded in some fashion? Why would I do such a thing? That's kind of an interesting question, I think. So I'm going to write them down and you're going to answer them. Well, obviously you get a chance to research a little bit or make sure you knew the answer. It would be quite different than a traditional deposition when we're sitting in the same room. So think about that. I'm going to come back to that point in a subsequent video.